Virtual connection. I've been working with Greywrath Industries for a while now, and in that time I can count on one hand how many times I had seen the elusive man in charge, Ethan Greywrath. Naturally, there was a lot of gossip surrounding him. I mean, why wouldn't there be? He was soon going to hit the billion mark. You don't make that kind of money without drawing some sort of attention to yourself and your activities. Sometimes I would sit at the office and fantasize about the things that I could do if I had all that money at my disposal. From the top of my head, I knew I wouldn't have to get into petty squabbles with my landlord over rent, or eat cup noodles until I lost all feeling in my mouth. And don't even get me started on the student debt that haunted my dreams every now and then. All of that would be gone in a flash if I had a small fraction of the Greywrath fortune. But alas, that was nothing but a pipe dream. I remember the first time I saw Ethan in person. It was alongside 19 other beta testers who had just concluded rigorous physical and mental examinations for his new super secret project we all had enlisted on. We started out as a group of 40 people. As the exams became more intense, many of us began to drop out. You see, we were a diverse group consisting of beta testers, gamers, and remote workers, none of whom were accustomed to physically demanding activities. However, I was fortunate enough to be into CrossFit and basketball, which kept me in decent shape. Before we were allowed to participate in the beta test for Greywrath, we underwent full physical evaluations and psychological exams to ensure our stability. According to the officials hosting us, the beta test would be one of the most demanding experiences we would ever face as human beings, and would be pushed beyond our limits. We were required to sign waivers that absolved Greywrath Industries of any responsibility in the event of any harm that might come to us during the testing period. I'll be honest with you, I was very skeptical. Nothing good ever came from signing death waivers. And I was about to back out when my eyes caught the payment breakdown on the second page of the contract. It stated that all participants will be required to live on site for the entire duration of the testing period due to security reasons. They will receive $5,000 as daily compensation for the 5 months. In addition, testers who successfully identify bugs and glitches in the game system will receive a $2,000 bonus. A reward of $50,000 will be given to those who beat the game during the 5-month testing period. Finally, a sum of $100,000 will be awarded to all beta testers who worked on the project at the end of the 5-month period. Call me greedy, but that was more than enough for me to throw caution to the wind and sign that waiver 3 times over. The figures on that contract would clear all of my debt and give me a fresh start. It wasn't a difficult decision to make. Anyways, Ethan was to address and debrief us on what we would be getting into after our physical trials were done and over with. Now, we were all hopeful to catch a glimpse of the multimillionaire at some point, but everyone gathered around that conference table was awestruck when Ethan walked in. We simply weren't ready. The formerly skinny man strolls in looking twice his previous size, Ethan Greywrath, and somehow bulked in size and was sporting shredded muscles everywhere. He was beyond recognition because even his platinum blonde hair had grown out to neck length and framed his chiseled face perfectly. Ethan looked like a Greek god who had descended from the heavens to grace us with his otherworldly presence. I found myself staring at the way his lithe muscles moved underneath his t-shirt. Said shirt was even struggling to contain all of him within the confines of its expandable fabric. Now don't get me wrong, he wasn't overly large or looking like one of those muscle-bound gym nuts on Long Island. No, Ethan looked like he was the pinnacle of perfect health. His skin seemed to even have a healthy shine and luster to it that made me and several others question our present life choices. All in all, Ethan looked damn good, and he moved around like his looks were the least of his problems. And knowing him now, they most likely were. As per usual fashion, he got right into business. He began with the reason for his disappearance from the public eye. Ethan explained that he was working on his latest project that would revolutionize gaming and the world at large. But here's the catch. It wasn't just any ordinary game. No. Ethan had been meticulously crafting a virtual reality experience, unlike anything the world had ever seen. To put it in his words, it could either make or break the world. He settled into his chair at the helm of the conference table. His piercing gaze scanned each of us as if daring us to doubt his words. My latest project, Legion, isn't just a game, he began, his monotone voice showing no hint of excitement. It's a journey. A journey that will not only benefit gamers and their gaming skills, but also every individual's physical and mental fortitude. I remember my curiosity being piqued by that line alone. What could he have meant by everyone in benefits? What kind? Ethan began to explain how his technology had been able to successfully hack the brain's hippocampus and thrust the players into another world that was just as real as this one. He claimed that the only difference between the world he had created and the world we presently live in was that not everyone could be able to be a part of his new world. Something about the way he had said those words made me feel like there was a lot more to this than he was letting on. But before I could venture down that path of reasoning, he continued. He went on to reveal the core concept behind his virtual creation he had titled Legion. It wasn't merely about sitting in front of a screen and mashing buttons, oh no. That was the easy part, bearing in mind that there was little to no sitting involved at all. The twist with Ethan's creation was that Legion required a very significant measure of real-world physical exertion and mental acuity. His clear-cut example was, if you can lift a couch in the real world, then you sure as hell won't be lifting a car in Legion. Ethan had explained that players, in our case beta testers, were only as powerful as our minds and bodies allowed us to be. If we wanted to pull off outlandish or supernatural feats, we would have to work very hard for it. It immediately began to make sense to me at that point. That was the reason why we had undergone all of those physical and mental exams. I had never been more glad that I was in active CrossFit. The game is designed to immerse players in a virtual world where they must complete a series of challenges to progress, Ethan explained, his passion for the project evident in his gestures. But here's the catch. The challenges are tailored to push your limits, both physically and mentally. He paused for effect, letting the gravity of his words sink in. Legion isn't just about entertainment, he continued, his voice brimming with confidence. It's about self-improvement. It's about pushing past your perceived limitations and discovering what you're truly capable of. As he spoke, I couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement coursing through me. This wasn't just another game. It was a potential game changer in the realm of mental and physical fitness. Ethan's eyes gleamed. With Legion, we're not just creating a virtual world, he declared. We're forging a new frontier, one where gamers become champions and where the boundaries between virtual and reality blur. 3 weeks later. By the 1 month mark, we had all but settled into the groove of things. Our numbers had significantly been reduced by 5. The challenges were as physically demanding as they were mentally exhausting. Ethan wasn't kidding when he mentioned that. The first part of our testing began with what our handler, Mr. Ross, called the Biome challenges. True to the name, we were thrust into extreme conditions to ensure that we had what it took to fully survive the VR simulation. Mr. Ross had explained that the players at home wouldn't have access to the physical and mental examinations we had undergone, so the Biome challenges were the next best thing. A foolproof sequence to ensure the user's body was ready to meet the harsh demands of the simulation. On my first day in the simulation, I had to swim 5 miles because we were spawned in what I thought was the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But the handler in charge of my session quickly cleared things up. He had explained that this present location represented my most glaring weakness and physical shortcoming, and that this present ocean biome was created by the game's artificial intelligence to help me overcome this weakness before I got into the actual game. Yes, you might have guessed it, but I didn't know how to swim. I wasn't the only one who was spawned into the ocean biome. There were roughly 5 of us in number, but at the end of the challenge, only 3 of us were successful. This was how the first month pretty much played out for me. Extreme challenges upon extreme challenges. Sometimes there was other data testers involved in my challenges, but more than often not. I was left to figure things out on my own. Outside the Greywrath VR, our living arrangements were top-notch. It was way nicer than my present apartment, sort of like an extremely fancy resort, and the luxury amenities were to die for, despite the sleeping arrangements being bunk style. The sleeping arrangements were a tad awkward because no one really wanted to interact with one another. We all saw each other as the competition and decided to keep to ourselves. Even during lunch and our gym sessions, nothing outside of stiff greetings was exchanged among us. Well, almost all of us. Todd and Jolene were the only exceptions. There were a couple, happily married, and according to them, they had been in the beta testing game for over a decade. They were both overly nice people, but something about the way they went about trying to befriend everybody rubbed me the wrong way. But I didn't pay it much mind. I couldn't afford to be distracted. By the time the first month was drawing to a close, the 5th beta tester had quit because she had a panic attack after being dropped from over 500 feet in the air without a parachute. I realized that we were yet to see Ethan again, and I found myself wondering if I'd ever have the opportunity to hear him speak in person again. I wanted his green eyes to hold my gaze again. A guy can dream, can he? My consolation and motivation remained the financial stipends I was receiving. It made it all worth it because by the time I ran my numbers in my head, I realized that I would pretty much be debt-free by the end of the second month. Second month of beta testing. The second month of testing was where things began to get a little too real, and a little too personal if you ask me. All 15 of us had successfully passed the Biome challenges and were introduced to the world of Legion. It was safe to say that it was unlike anything we had imagined. The best way to describe the simulation was like being transported to another reality that was not too different from ours, but still strikingly unique in its own way. You see, the game sequence kicks off in a modern-day city, and depending on your mission, assignments, and story sequence, you can travel between realms and realities. As at the second month, I was chanced with visiting the fairy-like realm with flesh-eating cannibals, and then a futuristic realm with Hamster's ruled with an iron fist. Mr. Ross explained that when the game was released to the public, the ability to move freely within realms would be restricted until the story sequence and challenges from the spawn point is completed. I didn't necessarily mind because herding through the realities and dealing with buggy missions were not my idea of a good time. With the entire game now readily made available to us, things began to heat up. Everyone began to take what they perceived to be the extra mile to clear their challenges and beat the game's campaign, while keeping an eye out for bugs in the simulation. Not me though. I didn't need to clock in overtime or anything of that sort, because I was happy with the amount that I would be getting by the end of the testing period. Besides, I had beta tested enough virtual reality simulations to know where a few bugs would definitely be. Rather than binge play like the others, my game plan was to let the others run ragged with their individual endeavors, while I would save my strength to clear my daily challenges. One evening, as I lounged by the bar after what had to be my toughest simulation yet, I nursed a glass of margarita as I placed an ice pack over my head. My latest assignment at the time was to go back in time and stop the highly intelligent hamsters from taking over the world. It sounded ridiculous and pretty straightforward, but I can assure you that it was anything but that. I had spent 6 months in the simulation meanwhile. I had only spent 12 hours of real-world time in the game. I had learned that each realm and immersion was different and had a unique time flow. It was incredibly weird once you got out of your haptic pod. So there I was by the bar trying to ease my migraine at the bar when a stoic voice spoke out behind me. You might want to get some of that ice underneath your left eye before it swells any more than it already has. I was tired, hungry, and felt like I'd been run over by a truck that was driving an even bigger truck, so naturally my reply wasn't the nicest. Leave me the hell alone and mind your business. It's been a long day already. I spat without looking back to see who had spoken to me. Sorry to break it to you, tough guy, but it is, as a matter of fact, my business. The stranger replied with a slight lilt to his voice. At that point, I felt whoever this person behind me was asking for it, and I was going to tear into him. The moment I turned around, I knew I had messed up because standing behind me in all of his nigh-trillionaire glory was Ethan Greywrath. I wanted to apologize, but he waved me off. He really didn't care about the things I had said to him. Max Allister, he said, like I was reading my name off of a roster of some clipboard. I must say I'm impressed with your simulation so far. You seem to know what you're doing. If getting my ass kicked by hamsters translates to knowing what I'm doing, then yes, I'm a bloody genius, I said as I pressed my forehead onto the bar. Oh no, that bit was embarrassing and downright laughable. No grown man should lose to a hamster in a fight, he chuckled, as he reached behind the counter and grabbed a bottle of vodka. I couldn't relive it. I made the Ethan Greywrath smile. I watched as he took a swig from the bottle before wiping his mouth and with the back of his hand. If you want, I can show you some basic moves to make sure you don't get jacked up like this again, he offered, thumbing over his shoulder. I wanted to refuse. I needed to refuse, because my head was screaming bloody murder, but it was too much of an opportunity to pass up on, sadly. I downed the last of my margarita and followed after my employer until we got onto the on-site gym. Ethan wasted no time in getting rid of his shirt and throwing on boxing gloves. It was truly a sight to behold. He looked as though he was carved from marble with his full chest and washboard abs. It was a miracle I was able to stop myself and focus on the beatdown that he proceeded to inflict on me. By the end of the sparring session, I was sporting a matching black eye on the right side of my face, but I had learned a lot. The most important thing that Ethan was a lot speedier and agile than he looked. As he towered over me, our lips mere inches apart as we both desperately gasped for breath, I thought this was going to be it. I thought he was definitely going to kiss me, because it was too perfect to pass up. Ethan remained on top, straddling me, with beads of sweat rolling down his face. After what seemed like an eternity, he leaned to the side of my ear and said, "Get cleaned up, Max. You've got an early session tomorrow." Now that I think about it, maybe I should have taken the plunge and kissed him instead. I mean, what's the worst that could have happened? 2 weeks later. Ever since word got out that I'd been training with Ethan, life at the Greywrath lodgings became incredibly difficult. During the simulations, the other testers would go out of their ways to hinder or sabotage me, and their excuse was that I was receiving preferential treatment from the boss. The only people who had bothered to listen to my side of the story were Todd and his wife. Well, usually they wouldn't be my first choice of acquaintances. I had to get my story out somehow. Not that it did much good anyways, because I continued to be all but tortured. The spar with Ethan 2 weeks ago was a one-time thing because I had never seen him since then. Besides getting a matching black eye, Ethan had taught me something invaluable. The basics he had shown me in the gym worked wonders in the simulation. It had made all of my combat-related simulations a lot easier. And with that, my approach to the Legion project changed drastically. You see, it was precisely around this time the 9 remaining beta testers had begun to give up on their personal campaign of completing the game. Legion seemed to have over 750 realms with unique stories and quests to complete. There was no way anyone would be finishing that under 5 months, even if we had all agreed to work with each other from the start. They had mostly stopped clocking overtime, opting to rather rest and recover from the tedious simulations. It was fairly easy for me to capitalize on this. I began my hunt for the few bugs that were in the simulation. It was easy to spot them if you know where to look for them, instead of starting from the actual game. I took a trip to the Biome challenges, and by the time I ran intense functional and localization testings on all of the 70 plus Biome locations, I was able to discover 12 bugs in just 1 week. The following week, while I was running of functionality tests on all of the hamster realm, the most unusual thing happened when I touched down. The moment I was booted into the realm, I was prepped to begin fending off a horde of the angry creatures. But to my surprise, they were already occupied with fighting what could only be described as a knight in crystalline armor. For one split second, I believed it to be an NPC that had ventured into their territory by accident. But the glowing circle underneath the knight's legs blatantly said otherwise. Those circles were unique to players, and the only players allowed in the simulation presently were the beta testers. And get this, we weren't given the option to modify our looks or outfits. We looked exactly the way we did in the real world, in our haptic suits, the exception being the lightweight bulletproof vests strapped onto our chests, and the holsters on our waists. Now I had 2 options. I could sneak off and pretend that I didn't see anything, or I could help out the knight. It was truly a dilemma, but at the end of the day, my humanity won the mental battle, and so I rushed to the knight's aid. By the end of the grueling battle, we had defeated the bulk of the hamster's forces, and just before I could introduce myself to the mysterious beta tester, he vanished. And little did I know that that would be the beginning of an unraveling. 4 hours later, I had just finished my route in the futuristic hamster realm, rinsed off and crashed into my bed, when the door to our lodgings was all but kicked in. Ethan walked into the shared living space, flanked by 2 guards, and all 10 of us were a tad frightened. Seeing Ethan was a rare occurrence in itself. The addition of the 2 stern-looking guards wasn't doing anything to ease the tense-looking situation. "Everybody out. We need the room," Ethan said in his usual monotone, but I had spent enough time with him up close to tell that this tone was laced with a bit of anger. The other beta testers didn't need to be told twice. They all exited the room. The guards that had accompanied Ethan left with them, probably securing the door from outside. Ethan's next words confused the hell out of me. "Why did you do it?" he asked, closing the gap between us and towering over me. I didn't understand what he was talking about, and I told him that much. He tapped on his wristwatch and a holographic display came alive from it. "In the last week, you've discovered 12 different bugs in the Biome section of Legion," he said, pointing to a flowchart that showed the glitches I had identified. While normally that might be a cause for celebration, someone had intentionally uplinked malware onto the Legion network. And then there is you, in the same time period, miraculously discovering bugs in the Biome section. A section that I had personally created, swept, and alpha tested," Ethan finished, waving the hologram projection away and folding his arm over his broad chest. I didn't know what to say. I knew how this looked, and there was no plausible explanation as to why I had suddenly begun to discover bugs around the time period malware was discovered in the network. I thought you were different, Max," Ethan sighed, running his hands through his hair. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't have security march you out of here." I didn't do this, Ethan. It's Mr. Greywrath to you. He cut me off pointedly. I didn't do this, Mr. Greywrath, I swear. I corrected myself, but still stood my ground. And I'm just supposed to take your word for it? Ethan scoffed. Check my logs. Rewatch all of my footage. You'd see that I set out those bugs in every biome with the standard approach. If I had tampered with the VR simulation, I wouldn't have done all of that. Trust me, nobody is that committed. I could almost see the gears turn in his head as he thought about my words. It was no secret that Ethan had been burned in the past. It was one of the more notable gossips surrounding him. His fiancée at the time, Jeffrey Leslow, had stabbed him in the back and stole his company's assets to create a rival company of his own that he had dubbed Amazon Industries. The narrative at the time was that Jeffrey never really loved Ethan to begin with. Despite both men being high school sweethearts, it was easy to see how that could have caused him to develop trust issues going forward. Ethan was just about to leave the room when I remembered that I had seen him in my last VR simulation. Ethan, wait. I saw something a few hours ago. I called out to him, and he stopped in his tracks. I took the opportunity to explain to him how I'd seen the strange knight in the crystalline armor. Ethan struggled to believe me. He reminded me that no one else has access to the network outside himself and the beta testers. He asked me to follow him into his office, and I gladly did. I thought he was going to pull up the recordings from my last simulation, but instead, he began speaking to something I couldn't quite see. Legion, give me a head count of everyone who has been inside the simulation in the last 24 hours. I was about to ask who he was talking to when a robotic voice filled the room all around us, seemingly speaking from everywhere all at once. In the last 24 hours, a sum total of 11 people have been in and out of the VR simulation. 10 beta testers, including Mr. Alistair, here and yourself. Ethan ran his hands through his hair again. I noticed that it was a nervous tic he couldn't shake off. Pull up Max's last simulation and a scan of his brain during the process, Ethan said, settling into his chair and interlocking his fingers in front of him. Yes, Mr. Greywrath. 2 large holographic screens suddenly materialized in front of him, showing a feed of my last simulation and a scan of my brain during the process. It was very weird watching myself traverse the VR simulation in the third-person perspective, but it was even more intriguing to see my brain respond to the different simulations and scenarios. Finally, the recording reached to the point where I had encountered the crystalline knight, and I had heard Ethan outwardly groan. That's him, right there, the strange knight I was talking about. Maybe he's the culprit, I said, pointing at the screen, excited that there was proof to back up my claims. I regret to inform you, Mr. Alistair, but the Crystal Knight is not the culprit. The voice Ethan had labeled Legion said. I felt the wind being taken out of my sail. What? Why? The Crystalline Knight was me, Ethan said, clearly frustrated. He explained that he had been actively working in the VR system since its alpha testing phase, and he was ironing out a few things in the hamster realm when the malware attacked him. He said it had begun by glitching his appearance and HUD. Then he completely lost his vision and was only able to fight back the attacking hamsters because the Legion AI was connected to him. He explained to me that while the other players would enter the simulation with just a partial dive via VR equipment, he would perform a full dive. This was made possible by connecting his hippocampus to the CPU of the Legion AI, using a neural chip that had been implanted into his brain. Isn't that dangerous? I asked. Thinking about all of that naturally made me worried for his health. It is, but it's a necessary risk that I can't ask anyone else to undertake on my behalf, Ethan said, diminishing the holographic projections of my simulation's feed. And that's why I was so upset when I thought you were behind the attack. I'm sorry about that, by the way. I shouldn't have accused you like that. Yes, you really shouldn't have accused Mr. Alistair like that, seeing as he saved your life, and you seem to harbor feelings for... That's enough. Initiate sleep protocol, Ethan barked, his cheeks straining red, with a blush. Feelings? For me? No way. Before I could even talk about it, he shut me down too. Don't get any ideas, Max. Legion has malware rotting his insides. Technically, that is incorrect, Mr. Greywrath. The malware is incapable of damaging me as an entity. It can only cause glitches in my VR simulations. What part of initiate sleep protocols do you not understand? Ethan all but roared. Initiating sleep protocols now, sir, Legion sadly announced. I didn't allow Ethan to direct the flow of the conversation any longer. My, Mr. Greywrath, you have feelings for me? I teased in a sing-song tone, feeling a little bolder now that I knew the emotions were mutual. Ethan pinched the bridge of his nose in frustration. Just forget about it, and like I said before, don't get any ideas. I don't fraternize with the employees or co-workers, he grumbled out, but it was as though he was trying to convince himself instead of me. I carefully moved closer to him, and all he could do was lean back in his swivel chair as I continued to invade his privacy. I wasn't sure what had come over me, but I was feeling bolder than usual. I'm sorry, but it's not something I think I can just forget, Mr. Greywrath. You all but harassed me back at the dorm. I need to be compensated somehow. How much do you want? Ethan's voice hitched as I placed my hand on his thick shoulder. Beneath all of those tough muscles was just a lonely man who was starved of affection and intimacy. It was easy to tell, just like he had done while we were sparring. I straddled him on his swivel chair and leaned into him, making sure my warm breath tickled his earlobe. If he didn't seem into it, I would have jumped right out the window. I don't want your money, Mr. Greywrath, I replied. Then what the hell do you want? Ethan hissed. I'll make do with a date, I replied almost immediately and pulled my face away to look into his eyes. You're insane. I'm gonna call security if you don't get out, Ethan heaved. While those words would be more than enough to deter anybody, myself included, Ethan's eyes simply lacked the conviction it usually had. But I humored him anyway. You're not going to call security, Mr. Greywrath, and we both know why. With my bit said, I hopped off of him and smoothed out my clothes. I assured the still flustered Ethan that I was just teasing, and honestly at that point, I was. Final month of beta testing. By the 5th month of the beta testing, we were down to just 5 beta testers, including myself, Todd, and 3 others. Todd's wife had been dropped from the program, yet Todd carried on like a good little soldier. Ethan had decided not to reveal the malware issue to the other beta testers or members of his staff. His reasoning was to allow the perpetrator to believe he or she had succeeded in compromising the VR network. Meanwhile, Ethan had reached out to me discreetly a few days after our incident. He needed my expertise in helping him isolate and deal with the malware issues. I knew it was an excuse for him to spend time with me, and I didn't mind it at all because he was incredibly attractive and intelligent, all at the same time. It didn't come as a surprise a week later when I found myself looking forward to our little private work sessions. The longer I spent time with Ethan, the fonder I grew of him. Beneath his stoic personality was an emotional man, and I spent the entirety of the 4th month slowly learning that aspect of him. Ethan was able to get a lot more comfortable in my presence and vice versa. We find ourselves pulling long nights together in his office dealing with the malware issue alongside the Legion AI. Ethan confided in me that the Legion AI was actually a living and self-sufficiently learning artificial intelligence he had mistakenly birthed in his bid to upload a fraction of his mind to the cloud. All of that is a story for another time. But the takeaway is that the Legion AI was alive and the malware in its VR systems was like a cancer that would only spread over time. So what we did was simple. Ethan isolated the VR systems from Legion's entity. He separated them both completely, while I ensured that the VR still functioned optimally while it was now detached from the Legion AI. The plan was a mess to begin with, and it took several weeks for us to stabilize the VR simulation to exist on its own. In the end, it was worth every second we had poured into it. By the final week of the 5th month, we had been able to isolate the malware of the hamster's realm of the VR system. We had decided to lock it away there until we were able to figure out a way to destroy the malware completely. With that done, Ethan made a part of that simulation unavailable to the masses, seeing as he couldn't delay the launch of the VR system. Ethan and I celebrated early, a day before the launch, by going out to catch dinner together. This was where our budding relationship took a progressive leap. Together we had left Greywrath property for the first time in 5 months. Ethan had booked a reservation for us both in an upscale restaurant, and after a beautiful dinner under the stars, I did the unthinkable. I kissed Ethan. It initially started off as another one of my infamous teasing sessions, but things got pretty heated up in the car, and I somehow found myself kissing him before we eventually ended up having sex back at his suite. The next morning, I had woken up pretty early to sneak out of Ethan's room when I caught Todd sneaking around the corridors. I quietly followed him, and he led me all the way to Ross's office. I was about to come out of hiding and maybe scare him, and go about my day, but the way he knocked down Ross's door was oddly suspicious. The moment he skulked into Ross's office after the knock, I came a little closer, and perched outside the window. There I heard them both converse. My warning bells had gone off the whole sneaking around, so naturally I got my phone out to record the interaction between Todd and Mr. Ross. You've done an excellent job so far sneaking the malware in, Ross said as he shook Todd's hands. He reached inside the desk and produced a fat envelope and slid across to the excited Todd. It's been a real pleasure working with you, Mr. Ross. The job's not done yet. I still need to go and disable the security measures Ethan has placed on the hamster realm and release the malware he had imprisoned. Ross said as he swiveled to face his computer and began typing away at the keyboard. I didn't need to hear anymore. I stopped recording the exchange and hurried back to Ethan's suite so I can fill him in on the disaster on our hands. On arrival, it was clear Ethan had headed out for the grand unveiling of Legion. Looking at the time, it was clear that I had less than 30 minutes to do something about the situation before Ethan launched Legion live on television. I hurried towards Ethan's office. If he wasn't around to deal with the situation, I figured I might as well give it a shot trying to handle it. By the time I made it to Ethan's office, there were about 3 guards chasing after me because I was in a restricted area of the complex. Naturally, Ethan's door was locked shut, but after screaming at the top of my lungs for Legion to let me in, the door gave way and I tumbled in before the guards could get to me. But it didn't stop them from banging away at the door and requesting for backup, as I all but collapsed onto his chair and began to work on resecuring the malware. I ran into a major problem when I realized that I needed Ethan's admin password to make the necessary changes to the system. I filled Legion in on what was going on, and he suggested to perform a full dive into the VR via the chip method, like Ethan. That way I wouldn't need to sew it manually with a computer. I didn't have much of a choice, seeing as the guards banging away at the door had tripled in number and were now actively working on collapsing the door's hinges. I took the syringe that contained the neural chip from Ethan's bottom desk, and with Legion's instructions, I injected it into the base of my skull. The effects were instantaneous. I felt a severe migraine as the chip, with the aid of the chemicals in the injection, traveled through my bloodstream and attached itself somewhere I couldn't quite describe. With that done, Legion guided me through Ethan's haptic setup. In the span of seconds, the world around me gave way to the familiar construct of Legion. It felt different to be in the admin seat. I was experiencing so much all at once. It felt like my brain might pop at the amount of information that was being passed through it. Luckily, I had spawned in the center of the hamster realm. From my admin POV, the malware was like tiny black bugs swarming towards an open door in the sky. My vitals began to go critical the moment I began to force the door close. The strain felt like it lasted for hours, when in reality it lasted for all but 10 seconds. And by the time I finally forced the door shut, I felt myself being yanked out of the VR system quite painfully. Conclusion. I woke up in a hospital outside of the country a week later, and guess who was there by my side waiting for me to come around? If you guessed Ethan, then you would be right on the money. Ethan filled me in on the events that took place after I had secured the malware in the hamster realm. It turns out that the guards had forced me out of the simulation without following proper safety protocols. I had suffered some damage, but it wasn't anything too serious, according to him. Todd and Ross had both been arrested. The video I had taken of them was incredibly damning. Ethan was beyond grateful, and after another week at the hospital, I was released. Once again, asked me to name a price, and I assured him that all I wanted was a proper first date. Ethan eventually agreed to my terms, and in the end, the first date we ended up going to was the first of many others we embarked on together. The end. If you were in Max's shoes, would you do the same to save Ethan's company? Let us know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to become part of our Rainbow Force, and stay wholesome.